like to follow accounts online that inspire me, that are a role model for me. I like to follow some non-political accounts too, some comedians, some musicians. But I have always made a point of watching what my critics and opponents say to know the other side of the story, to know what I have to rebut, and occasionally to acknowledge that the other side once in a while has a point, once in a while to make me reconsider my own thoughts. So I sample from the enemy. I look at anti-Semitic and pro-Hamas and pro-woke accounts. But look, there's no way you can consume that much enemy propaganda without having it emotionally affect you. You start to think that everyone in the world is a barbarian and that everyone in the world is full of bloodlust. Everyone's cheering for violence, that countries far away are reverting to ancient levels of barbarity and violence and cruelty, as Hobbes would say, where life was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And when you see our own Canadian civility, our politeness, our mutual friendship, our high trust society, our sense of community being replaced by people who cheer for violence. And worst of all, when our own national leaders abide it and our media encourage it or hide it. I can't believe this tweet from CTV News last night. A woman was murdered by Hamas, a Canadian woman, and she was so brutalized it took weeks to identify her remains. And here's what CTV News said, quote, Canadian peace activist Vivian Silver, who went missing after Hamas attack, has died. Really, just died. And here's what Trudeau's foreign minister said about the same woman. Melanie Joly says, Vivian Silver was a proud Israeli Canadian and lifelong advocate for peace. I met her son in Tel Aviv and he described her as kind, generous, and selfless. Canada mourns her loss with him and her loved ones. So she's lost. It's a loss. She's lost, is she? What happened? Did COVID get her, maybe? Why won't Melanie Joly say what happened to her, that she was murdered? Why won't Joly say who did the murder? You know why. Oh, and another synagogue was vandalized. What does the Quinty News have to say? Place of worship vandalized. Oh, that's pretty generic. I'll read the entire article to you. A place of worship in Belleville's East End was vandalized early Tuesday. City police report a congregation member called saying he'd advised a man who approached the front of the building at 6:30 in the morning that it was closed to the public. At that point, it's alleged the man walked to the west side of the place of worship and smashed a window. Police arrived quickly and arrested a 44-year-old suspect from British Columbia and charged him with mischief under $5,000. He was held for a bail hearing. Police say there's no evidence to suggest the crime was hate motivated. Oh, really? Is that the case? Then why won't you say it's a synagogue? And what is the name of the accused attacker? You'd have to check a different newspaper to learn any actual facts about it. There's a synagogue, of course. My point is, if you only look at the world through a certain lens, it looks pretty bleak. The kids call it doom scrolling. When people keep going through their social media feeds hour after hour, just consuming more and more and more bleak news. I do that sometimes, but doom scrolling can get you down. Sometimes you just have to put the cell phone down and go outside for a walk, I say, giving myself advice. And although we have to be skeptics, and I'd rather be a pessimist who's proven wrong than an optimist who's proven wrong. I hate saying the words, I told you so. But I still think maybe once in a while we ought to take a moment to look at some good news. It's not great news, but it is not completely bleak out there. Let me share with you some okay news. For one thing, today, there are about 250,000 people who marched in Washington, D.C. in support of Israel and against anti-Semitism. And it was peaceful. And there were no threats and no calls for genocide or jihad. There were Israeli flags and U.S. flags too. And it was positive. It was sad, but it was positive. And the fact that 250,000 Jews and righteous Gentiles went out to march is remarkable. I mean, the woke left are professional activists. They are often students or government workers or even people on social assistance. They are at leisure, let's say. They're the kind of perpetual rent-a mob with professional activists and organizers like public sector union bosses and Antifa types. But the crowd today was very different. Severely normal people who don't usually go to protests. I found it encouraging. I even saw some Democrats there, and that made me feel good, not because I like Democrats, but because it confirmed for me that no, the entire Democratic Party has not yet lost its mind and gone full Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, full Ilhan Omar, and that there are even some Democrats willing to stand for Israel's right to exist and Israel's right to fight back against a Nazi-style terrorist group. Here's a U.S. State Department spokesman, Matthew Miller is his name, actually pushing back on the blood libel that Israel is attacking hospitals. Listen to this yesterday.
We would love to see all the people that are calling for Israel to take steps to protect hospitals call for Hamas to vacate the hospitals and stop using civilians as human shields. We would love to see Hamas take some of the fuel reserves it's sitting on and use that to supply hospitals in northern Gaza. We would love to see Hamas have taken the fuel that Israel offered it yesterday that they declined for use at Al-Shifa Hospital. So it's a very difficult situation. And I would say as a principle, I'll just restate what I said at the top, is we do not want to see civilians caught in the crossfire.
I found that clarity surprising and encouraging. Here's the German chancellor standing up to the new Hamas Nazis just yesterday. Aren't you glad to hear this in German?
Bei Israel eine Demokratie. Auch das muss sehr klar gesagt werden. Und auch darüber gibt es keinen Zweifel. Und das werden wir auch in jedem Gespräch und bei jeder Gelegenheit betonen, dass das unsere Sicht der Dinge ist. Ein Land im Übrigen, das sich den Menschenrechten, das sich dem Völkerrecht verpflichtet fühlt und in seinen Aktionen auch dementsprechend handelt. Und deshalb sind die Vorwürfe, die gegen Israel da erhoben werden, absurd. Und daran kann es gar keinen Zweifel geben.
That's good news. I mentioned to you the other day that the Muslim Brotherhood front group called the National Council of Canadian Muslims, they commissioned a poll about Canadian views on Hamas. Only 8% of Canadians called Hamas freedom fighters. The rest saw them as terrorists or a front group for Iran. I'm sort of surprised that the NCCM published that poll anyways, because it makes them look so obscure and marginal and radical. And I also see the latest polling numbers federally for the election, and Justin Trudeau has never been this low. It's his worst ever. He's almost behind the NDP. He's almost in third place. And yes, there are lots of reasons besides his handling of the Hamas-Israel issue, of course. Inflation, cost of living, cost of housing, crime, his bizarre carbon tax exemption just for his friends, a zillion things. I know that. But those were all in effect 5 weeks ago. He has fallen to a record low in the past 5 weeks, and I put it to you that his handling of the war issue is part of it. He'll never be pro-Hamas enough for the extremists, but his attempt to pander to them nonetheless is so palpable and so gross to the majority of Canadians who see it for what it is. I actually think that his approach to the war is hurting him in the polls. He'll never be able to outbid the kooky NDP and Green Party in terms of anti-Semitism. So he's losing some Islamist support to them, but he's losing more normal Canadian voters because he's so awfully apologetic for Hamas and he so grossly smears Israel. And then you have atrocious comments like Melanie Joly. I say again that one of the safest places in the world right now to be a Jew, as crazy as it sounds, is the United Arab Emirates. Because they don't allow pro-Hamas marches. They don't allow actual violence of pro-terrorist or pro-terrorist activism. I've heard it said about Saudi Arabia too. Look at this news story. It's an Arab report, but it cites the Wall Street Journal that says the Saudi military apparently shot down a ballistic missile shot by Iran-backed extremists in Yemen that was aimed at Israel. I saw an unsourced report that Jordan did the same thing about a missile shot from Iraq. Now, you have to take these reports with a grain of salt. Maybe it was an Israeli interceptor, or maybe an American one. There's 2 aircraft carriers out there. But my point is, just because Hamas and its sponsor Iran and its safe harder Qatar and all the Western universities, because they all love Hamas, doesn't mean the rest of the Arab world does. A lot of countries are not thrilled about what Israel is doing, but they understand that Hamas launched a brutal terrorist attack, one that Israel had to respond to, and one that was clearly designed to fracture the Abraham Accords peace deal. And that accord was seeing remarkable peace progress between Israel and its Arab neighbors. I think that peace remains in place. I think that is good news.